You are listening to a podcast produced by Quote By.
All right, so we're diving deep today into Dr.B.R Ambedkar's journey to Buddhism. I think you're going to find this really fascinating. We're going to be looking at why he chose this path, and we're going to do it through his own words, using his 1950 essay, Buddha and the Future of His Religion. Now, what's really interesting here is this was published 6 years before his formal conversion to Buddhism. It's like we're getting a sneak peek into his mind as he's really grappling with these big questions.
Yeah, and even at this early stage, you can see his analytical mind just dissecting different religions, and Buddhism, it just stands out for him, for some very specific reasons.
You can see it right away, right from the start. He's comparing Buddha to these really major figures. You know, Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna. And he points out something that really struck me when I was reading this Buddha's humility. He wasn't claiming to be a god or even like a savior figure.
Exactly. And Ambedkar really highlights this difference, using the terms Margadatta and Mokshadatta. So think of it this way, Margadatta is like a guide, someone who shows you the path, whereas Mokshada is someone who claims to actually grant you salvation directly. And Buddha really saw himself as the former, as a guide, showing people the way to liberation. And this contrasts so sharply with these other figures like Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, who really presented themselves as the ultimate source of salvation,
That's much more about empowering people to find their own way.
Yeah.
That's such a different approach. And it feels like this emphasis on individual agency was a big part of what drew Ambedkar to Buddhism. But there's even more to it than that, right? Because he also talks about Buddha's emphasis on reason and experience.
Absolutely. Buddha he encouraged his followers to question his teachings, to test them against their own experiences, and to adapt them if needed. And it's this dynamic nature of Buddhism, this openness to change and growth, that really resonated with Ambedkar.
It's almost like a scientific approach to spirituality, isn't it? Now, when Ambedkar compares Buddhism to Hinduism, I think things get even more interesting. He highlights a really fundamental difference between the two: morality.
Yeah, for Buddha, morality was really the foundation of his teachings, and he redefined the term Dhamma to really prioritize ethical conduct above all else. It wasn't about performing elaborate rituals, it was about how you actually lived your life, how you treated other people. And this was a stark contrast to the Hinduism of his time, which placed a heavy emphasis on, these rituals like yagnas and yagas.
Actions speak louder than rituals, huh?
Yeah.
And this focus on ethical conduct. It leads us to another key point of difference that Ambedkar highlights, which is the issue of social inequality, particularly the caste system, or what's known in Hinduism as Chatavarna.
And Buddha really actively challenged the caste system by, admitting people from all castes, including Shudras, which is the lowest caste, and even women, into his monastic order. And this was just unheard of in traditional Hinduism, which had these very strict social hierarchies. Ambedkar even goes on to criticize the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu scripture, for actually trying to justify the caste system through this concept of guna karma.
Now, for those who may not be familiar with guna karma, it's basically saying that your birth caste is determined by inherent qualities and your actions in past lives. So if you're born into a lower caste, it's because of something you did in a past life.
Right. And Ambedkar saw this as a way to really solidify and justify social inequality by making it seem like it's divinely ordained. It's like it was baked into the system.
Yeah.
And for Ambedkar, this rejection of inherent inequality, it was fundamental, It wasn't just about personal beliefs. It was about creating a just and equitable society for everyone.
And that's what's so powerful about his perspective, right? It's rooted in this really deep concern for social justice. But it wasn't enough for her to just criticize the existing systems. He was actually looking ahead. He really envisioned this future for Buddhism in India, where it could offer a real alternative to what he was seeing as kind of this growing disillusionment with Hinduism.
He really did. And it's almost like he was kind of anticipating the challenges that Buddhism would face in the modern world and starting to lay out solutions. Even then, he even draws a parallel with Christianity replacing paganism in the Roman Empire. And he believed that Buddhism, with its emphasis on equality and reason, could actually fill a similar void in India.
Wow, that's a pretty bold comparison.
Yeah.
And to really assess how Buddhism stacked up, he came up with these 4 criteria for what he considered a viable religion. He's talking about things like societal cohesion through morality, alignment with science and reason, upholding liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the rejection of the glorification of poverty.
And what's amazing is for him, Buddhism, it ticked all the boxes, like while other religions might have some of these elements, he saw Buddhism as the most kind of comprehensive and compelling option.
So it really wasn't just a personal spiritual journey for him. It was like a really deeply thought out decision based on his analysis of what he thought a just and equitable society actually needs to function. And this is where I think the idea of renunciation comes into play. And I think it's important to unpack this a little bit because it often gets kind of misunderstood or misrepresented.
Yeah,
What do you mean by that?
Well, Ambedkar argued that while personal renunciation, like, simplifying your life, letting go of material attachments that could be admirable, he really felt that the glorification of poverty as some sort of spiritual ideal was actually harmful because it perpetuated suffering and it kept people trapped in a cycle of deprivation.
It's like saying, poverty is holy, which doesn't really help anyone, does it?
No, it doesn't.
He wanted like a Buddhism that empowered people to improve both their material conditions and their spiritual lives. He wanted people to thrive, not just survive.
Exactly. And you see this throughout his work, this idea of what we might call engaged Buddhism, a Buddhism that's actively involved in solving real-world problems.
So, no starving Buddha on a pedestal, but an active force for positive change in the world.
Yes, I like that.
That's a really important distinction, I think. Now, one of the things that always struck me about Ambedkar was how practical he was. He wasn't just talking about these like grand ideals. He was actually proposing concrete actions to make them a reality, like his idea of a Buddhist Bible, for example.
Oh, this was revolutionary.
Really?
Yeah, he recognized the power of having a concise and really impactful text that could capture the essence of the Buddha's teachings and make them accessible to a much wider audience. Think about the impact of texts like the Bible or the Quran. They've shaped entire civilizations. And Ambedkar, he wanted something similar for Buddhism.
He was really envisioning this text that could cut through, like, centuries of interpretations and all these commentaries and all these different layers and just get to the heart of what the Buddha actually taught.
Yeah.
It's like he understood that we need to distill these complex ideas into something clear and relatable that could actually speak to people, across cultures and languages.
He was a visionary, there's no doubt about that. And he also really emphasized the need for a more engaged Sangha, the monastic order. He wanted them to be more like educators and social workers, actively involved in the community and really working to uplift people's lives.
So instead of being, isolated in monasteries, he saw them being out in the world, working side by side with people, really.
Absolutely. He was calling for a Buddhism that was integrated into the very fabric of society, a real force for social transformation.
Now, given all of this, what makes Buddhism, from Ambedkar's perspective, such a compelling alternative, in a world that's still grappling with so much inequality, and especially in the context of his own experiences and the struggles of the Dalit community?
I think it's really crucial to remember the historical context here. Dalit communities, they face centuries of just systemic discrimination and exclusion under the caste system. And Ambedkar, he experienced this firsthand. And Buddhism, with its radical emphasis on equality and its just outright rejection of caste, it offered this really powerful message of liberation. It was a way for Dalits to reclaim their dignity, their humanity, and their right to a just society.
It's almost like he was saying, hey, this is a system that works.
Yeah.
It helped me break free, and it can help you too.
Exactly. And his own conversion to Buddhism was such a powerful symbol, He wasn't just talking the talk, he was walking the walk. And that really resonated so deeply with millions of people who were searching for a way out of this cycle of oppression. Ambedkar gave voice to their aspirations and showed them a path forward.
It's amazing how one person's journey can have such a huge ripple effect. He really did spark a social and spiritual revolution. But it wasn't just about, blind faith. It was about reason, compassion, and concrete action.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Ambedkar's legacy so enduring. He challenged people to think critically, to question the status quo, and to actually fight for a better world. His vision of Buddhism wasn't passive. It was about really engaging with the world, working to alleviate suffering, and creating a more just and equitable society for everyone.
So what can we take away from all of this? What makes Ambedkar's choice of Buddhism and his vision for its future so relevant today?
Yeah.
But did he really think Buddhism had a future, A real chance to make a comeback.
He absolutely did.
Seriously?
He predicted a resurgence of Buddhism, especially in India.
Wow.
He felt people would eventually move away from the limitations of Hinduism and come back to Buddhism.
And wasn't Ambedkar's own conversion to Buddhism in 1956 proof of how strongly he believed in this?
It was a huge statement, yeah. He was putting his beliefs into action. But he didn't just stop there.
He converted and then...
He had this whole vision for how to bring Buddhism back to life.
Okay, this is getting interesting. What did he have in mind?
He even called for the creation of a concise, accessible Buddhist text, something that everyone could understand.
Like a Buddhist Bible, almost. That's a fascinating idea. Imagine a Buddhist text as influential as other religious holy books.
Right. But that wasn't all.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. He also had some thoughts on the Bhikkhu Sangha, the Buddhist monastic order.
Right, the monks. We're talking earlier about how he wanted them to be more involved in the world.
He felt they were too removed, too focused on themselves, and not doing enough to actually help people.
So what did he think they should be doing?
He wanted them to be more like the Jesuits in the Catholic Church.
Known for their scholarship in social work.
Exactly. He wanted them to be out there, actively contributing to society, not just meditating on a mountaintop.
That's a pretty radical shift from the image most people have of Buddhist monks.
It is. But we're just scratching the surface of Ambedkar's vision here.
There's more.
Oh, yeah, a lot more. He believed that true religion had to do more than just meet your spiritual needs.
So it couldn't just be about personal enlightenment or whatever?
It had to address the material conditions of people's lives, the real problems they faced every day.
Now, that's something I think we can all relate to.
Definitely. He believed that true religion had to address not just spiritual needs, but the material conditions of people's lives. You know, he saw Buddhism as advocating for social, intellectual, economic, and political freedom.
Wow, that's a much broader vision than a lot of people might associate with Buddhism. It sounds like he saw it as a blueprint for creating a truly just and fair society. Did he think other religions were capable of this?
He argued that no other existing religion really came close to this kind of vision. He really felt that for a modern world, a world that's changing so rapidly, Buddhism was the answer.
So he wasn't just theorizing, he actually saw this as a real path forward for humanity.
Absolutely. And he laid out specific steps for how this Buddhist revival, this resurgence, could happen.
Okay, so what did that plan actually look like?
Well, first, he believed that Buddhism needed a clear and concise text, something accessible that captured the essence of what Buddha taught. He felt like the sheer volume of Buddhist literature was a hurdle for a lot of people.
It can be overwhelming, for sure.
Yeah.
So much to read, so many different interpretations.
Right, so he felt a more focused text, something like a gospel, was needed.
Okay, so a single, powerful text to really drive the message home.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. It's hard to grasp any philosophy or religion when you're trying to sift through mountains of texts. But what would this Buddhist Bible, what would it actually contain?
He envisioned it, including a short biography of Buddha, hitting the key points of his life, and then some of the most important dialogues and teachings. He even thought about including a guide for Buddhist ceremonies for those big life moments, you know, birth, marriage, death.
Oh, interesting. So like rituals and ceremonies specifically for Buddhists. He wanted to create something that people could really connect with on a personal level through all stages of life.
Exactly.
It sounds like he was almost imagining a Buddhist version of a Book of Common Prayer or something, a guide for living. But a text alone wouldn't be enough, would it, to bring about this Buddhist revival he was talking about?
He knew that. He also recognized the need for a revitalized Bhikkhu Sangha, that's the Buddhist monastic order.
Right, the monks. And we were just talking about how Ambedkar wanted them to be more engaged with the world, to step out of the monasteries and really make a difference. What were his specific criticisms, though? What did he feel they were doing wrong?
He felt like a lot of monks were too caught up in meditation, too focused on achieving personal enlightenment. And he worried that they were neglecting their duty to actually serve the community. Like, what were they giving back?
So it wasn't enough to just work on yourself. You had to actually contribute to the well-being of others.
Exactly. And he kept coming back to the Jesuits, you know, how they were known for their scholarship, their education, their social work. That's what he wanted to see from the Buddhist monks.
So a Sangha that wasn't just intellectually vibrant, but actually out there making a difference in people's lives. What did he think the monks needed to know to be able to accomplish this?
He believed they needed to be well-versed in the arts and sciences, not just Buddhist teachings. He really felt like they needed a broader education in order to truly guide and serve people.
Wow, so a pretty radical transformation of the monastic tradition, turning it into a real force for social change. But did his vision stop at reforming the monastic order? Was that the extent of his plan?
No, he went even further. He actually saw a need for a world Buddhist mission, a real organized effort to spread the faith globally. He knew this would require resources, both financial and human, and he actually called on Buddhist nations to support this mission.
So not just a revival within India, but a full-blown global movement. Ambedkar was thinking big. Did he honestly believe the world was ready for this? Did he think people would be receptive to this kind of message?
He did. He argued that people were becoming disillusioned with the old religions, that they were starting to question whether those religions were really relevant in a world that was being shaped by science and social change.
It sounds like he was anticipating the rise of secularism, that shift away from traditional religion, and that search for meaning outside of the old faiths. Was he right? I mean, are we seeing that happening today?
He was incredibly insightful in a lot of ways. He felt people were searching for answers, searching for a more just world, and that they would naturally be drawn to Buddhism's core principles, reason, compassion, equality.
It's amazing how, writing back in 1950, he seemed to foresee so many of the issues we're still grappling with today. The decline of traditional religions, people searching for ethical frameworks, the fight against inequality, it's all there in his writings. Has his prediction of a Buddhist revival, has it actually come to pass? Are we seeing that happening?
He was a visionary, that's for sure. And while Buddhism hasn't achieved global dominance, it's definitely experiencing a resurgence in popularity, especially in the West.
It makes you wonder if, in some ways, his vision is starting to play out, even if it's unfolding a bit differently than he might have imagined. Was there anything else in his essay that he felt was particularly important? Anything you think our listeners should know?
There's one more point I wanted to touch on, something I think is really relevant for our listeners. Remember how we talked about his belief that true religion has to align with reason and science?
Yeah, that was a big part of his argument for why he felt Buddhism was so relevant.
Well, he goes a step further and actually lays out specific criteria for judging any religion. And it goes beyond just being compatible with science. He says a religion has to do more than just provide comfort or spiritual solace.
So it's not enough to just feel good or believe in something bigger than yourself?
Right. He argued that a true religion has to offer mental and moral relief to the suppressed and the downtrodden. Those were his exact words.
Wow, those are strong words. So it's not enough to just talk about love and compassion. A religion has to actually work to alleviate suffering, to fight for justice.
Exactly. And he felt any religion that failed to do this was basically doomed to become irrelevant.
That's a high bar for any faith. But it's also a pretty compelling challenge, especially in a world where, let's be honest, inequality and injustice are still huge problems. I'm actually really curious to hear more about his thoughts on Hinduism specifically. I mean, he clearly had some strong opinions on the matter.
Oh, he did. He had some pretty pointed criticisms about Hinduism's shortcomings in this area. And that's a conversation I think we need to have next.
All right, so let's unpack those criticisms of Hinduism. What did Ambedkar see as its biggest problems?
Well, Ambedkar was deeply concerned about Hinduism's impact on Indian society, especially when it came to how it treated the lower castes and women. He argued that Hinduism didn't just tolerate inequality, it actually kept it going through its teachings and social structures.
We've touched on this before, but I think it's worth repeating. Buddha's rejection of the caste system was absolutely revolutionary. I mean, especially in the context of ancient India.
It was a complete break from the norm. And for Ambedkar, who experienced that caste discrimination firsthand, it wasn't just some abstract idea. It was deeply personal and powerful. He saw Buddha's embrace of equality as a direct challenge to that whole system of Hindu social hierarchy.
It sounds like he saw Buddhism as a path to freedom, not just in a spiritual sense, but in a real social and political way.
He did. And he felt that Hinduism, with its ideas of karma and reincarnation, actually justified the suffering of the lower castes. It's like it was saying, well, you deserve your suffering because of what you did in a past life.
That must have been a hard pill to swallow. The idea that your suffering is your own fault because of some cosmic debt you owe is pretty disempowering.
It is. And Ambedkar saw it as a form of spiritual oppression, a way to keep the lower castes stuck in a cycle of poverty and powerlessness.
So in a way, he saw Buddhism as offering a way out of that. a way to break free from both social and spiritual oppression. Did his critique go beyond the caste system?
It did. He also believed that Hinduism's focus on rituals and the afterlife distracted people from dealing with the actual problems in their lives.
So it was too focused on the otherworldly, on achieving moksha, that liberation from the cycle of rebirth, while Buddhism was more about addressing the root causes of suffering right here and now.
Exactly. Ambedkar saw Buddhism as a call to action, a call to build a more just and compassionate world, and he felt this message was something the modern world desperately needed.
So to sum it up, it sounds like Ambedkar's view of Buddhism wasn't just about personal enlightenment or spiritual transcendence. It was about transforming society, creating a world where everyone has a chance to live a good life, free from suffering and oppression.
Exactly. And he believed this message was super relevant as the world was dealing with things like colonialism, new ideologies, and the challenges of building a more just global society.
And of course, at the heart of it all was his conviction that a religion had to align with science and reason to survive in the modern world.
Absolutely. He felt that Buddhism, with its emphasis on critical thinking, questioning, and empirical observation, was uniquely suited for that.
He even highlighted how Buddha himself encouraged people to put his teachings to the test, to see if they held up against their own experiences and understanding, not just blindly accepting them.
Right. And that openness to inquiry, that willingness to adapt and evolve, was crucial for any religion that wanted to stay relevant in a world increasingly shaped by science and reason.
It's like he was saying, don't be afraid to question, to think for yourselves, to use your reason to find the truth.
Precisely. And this was just another reason why Ambedkar felt so strongly about Buddhism. He saw it as a faith that could embrace the spiritual and the material, the ancient and the modern, the individual and the collective.
Ambedkar's vision was clearly rich and complex. It's no wonder he dedicated so much of his life to studying and promoting Buddhism. But for our listeners today, here in the 21st century, what does it all mean? What can we take away from this deep dive into his thinking?
Ambedkar's legacy is multifaceted and full of valuable insights. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we can't separate our spiritual and ethical lives from the social and political realities around us.
We can't just focus on our own enlightenment or salvation and ignore the suffering and injustice in the world.
Right. Ambedkar reminds us that true liberation, true compassion, means engaging with the world, fighting for justice, creating a society where everyone has a chance to flourish.
And he encourages us to really examine our beliefs, to ask ourselves how our religions and ideologies are either contributing to that goal or getting in the way. He's definitely given us a lot to think about.
He has, and those questions are even more pressing today than they were back then.
So, to wrap things up, it's clear that Ambedkar saw Buddhism as more than just a religion. He saw it as a way of life, a philosophy that called for personal transformation and social action.
It was. And while his prediction of a global Buddhist revival may not have happened exactly as he imagined, his ideas are still powerful and relevant. They challenge us to think deeply about the role of faith, reason, and social justice in our lives.
It's a powerful legacy that encourages us to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more just and compassionate world.
It is. And with that, I think we'll leave our listeners with one final, thought-provoking question. Could Ambedkar's vision of a modern, socially engaged Buddhism, with its focus on reason, equality, and practical solutions, be a path forward in our world? A world that's struggling with so much uncertainty and division. It's something to think about as we continue our own journeys of learning and discovery.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth wherever it may lead you.
Subscribe, like, and share the Quote By channel for more helpful information.